Here's something almost nobody wants to hear. The most powerful thing you can ever do for yourself has nothing to do with words. No perfect comeback, no final speech, no dramatic goodbye, just complete quiet. And that quiet, that absence of sound, can shake the foundation of someone whose whole world is built on being heard, being seen, being in charge. Think about that for a second. One moment of silence can undo years of emotional chaos. Stay with me right now, because what I'm about to share next will change the way you look at silence forever, and it might even change the way you look at yourself in the mirror. Imagine, just for a moment, that every message you ever sent, every argument you ever started, every tear you ever shed, trying to make someone understand your pain, did not heal the relationship, it actually fed it. That is the first lesson almost nobody talks about. Most people walk away from these situations believing that if they had just explained themselves better, if they had found the right words, if they had been calmer, smarter, or more patient, things would have turned out differently. But that belief is built on a lie, because the entire system you were caught in was never designed to reward your honesty. It was designed to harvest your attention. Now let that sink in for a moment. Have you ever lost sleep wondering whether you should send one last message? Have you ever typed something out on your phone, stared at it for 10 minutes, and then either deleted it or sent it with shaking hands? Have you ever replayed the same conversation in your head for days, weeks, even months, looking for the moment where everything went wrong? If any of that has ever happened to you, then keep watching, because by the time we finish here, you will understand something that might genuinely set you free. Your silence was never weakness. Your silence was the first move you ever made that came from a place of real inner strength. One of the biggest myths people carry with them after these relationships is the idea that silence is simply the absence of conversation. That assumption is flat out wrong. Silence becomes one of the most psychologically loaded events in the entire dynamic because it breaks a pattern the other person has come to rely on completely. For a long stretch of time, the relationship followed a rhythm that felt painfully familiar. There were moments of warmth, even tenderness, followed by sharp criticism, confusing mixed signals, emotional withdrawal, or sudden conflict that came out of nowhere. And every single time, you responded, you explained yourself, you defended your intentions, you apologized, sometimes for things you had absolutely no business apologizing for, because the pressure of the moment forced you into it. Every one of those responses gave the other person exactly what they wanted. They learned which words made you flinch. They learned which topics kept you engaged for hours. They learned how much emotional energy you would pour out just to keep the peace. And here is the part that really stings when you finally see it. It did not matter whether the interaction was loving or hostile. What mattered was that you stayed involved. Your availability, your openness, your willingness to keep trying kept that cycle alive long after it should have died. Then comes the day you stop reaching out. And everything changes. The predictable rhythm is gone, the messages stop, the explanations vanish, the desperate attempts to make them see your side just disappear. From your point of view, this silence feels protective, almost like a survival instinct kicking in. But from their point of view, something much larger is happening. They have just lost the psychological system they were running. They no longer receive the reassurance that they can pull your strings whenever they want. They no longer get the satisfaction of watching you react on cue. And even if they would never admit this out loud, they are now face to face with something they cannot stand: uncertainty. They do not know what you are thinking. They do not know if you are angry, calm, healing, or quietly moving on with your life. They have no script to read, no emotion to measure, no familiar pattern to exploit, and that alone can shake them more than any final speech ever could, because control, for someone like this, runs on predictability. Take away the predictability and their confidence cracks. Think about that for a second. Now here is something important, and please do not miss this. This does not mean they suddenly feel genuine remorse. This does not mean they wake up one morning flooded with empathy, ready to call a therapist and apologize for everything. It is critical to separate the feeling of emotional loss from the feeling of losing influence. Most people assume that silence will finally make the other person love them the way they always wanted to be loved. But relationships built around control rarely operate on love in the first place. What the other person usually notices first is not the disappearance of you as a human being. What they notice is the disappearance of access. The familiar source of attention is no longer available. The reassurance they used to get from your engagement is no longer flowing in. The emotional reactions they used to provoke on command no longer happen, and that shift creates a very specific kind of discomfort inside them. It might show up as confusion, it might show up as frustration, it might even show up as a strange urgency they cannot explain to themselves. The pattern they relied on for months or years has been disrupted, and they have no idea how to fix it. That is exactly why silence hits so much harder than endless arguments or carefully rehearsed explanations ever could. Arguments keep both people emotionally attached. Every response you send confirms that the other person still lives inside your emotional world. Silence does the opposite. It removes that confirmation completely. There is no predictable script to follow. There is no emotional fuel to draw from. There is no obvious way to measure whether they still have any power at all over how you feel. In many situations, that absence speaks more clearly than any words could because it communicates something that explanations almost never achieve. The cycle has finally been broken. One of the hardest emotional truths to accept after walking away from one of these relationships is that what you experienced as love may have looked very, very different on the other side. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, emotional safety, real empathy, and an actual desire for both people to grow side by side. But relationships anchored in heavy narcissistic patterns are usually organized entirely around influence, not around intimacy, not around depth, not around genuine partnership, around control. Now, that does not mean these individuals are incapable of feeling anything. Some of them clearly do experience attachment. Some of them even feel real affection in certain moments. But the attachment they feel is usually tied to holding their position in the dynamic, not to nurturing an equal emotional bond. That distinction matters more than people realize because it completely changes how you should interpret their behavior after you stop reaching out. When communication suddenly ends, many people secretly hope that the other person will finally see their worth. They hope for regret. They hope for accountability. They hope for one of those dramatic late-night apologies that fix everything. While moments of regret are technically possible, what usually grabs the other person's attention first is something far less romantic. They realize they are no longer directing the emotional rhythm of the relationship. Think about what that means. Throughout the entire relationship, they may have grown used to deciding when conversations happened. They chose when affection appeared. They decided when conflict began. They decided when things were okay again. And every time there was a disagreement, they fully expected you to come running back. They expected you to explain yourself. They expected you to apologize. They expected you to seek their approval before you felt safe again. That expectation created a deep sense of psychological certainty. They believed the relationship would keep revolving around their choices because it always had. The moment you never reach out again, that certainty collapses. Suddenly, they are no longer the person calling the shots. They are not the one deciding when contact happens. They are forced to face the fact that someone else has stepped outside the system they used to control. And for someone whose entire sense of security depends on being able to shape another person's choices, that shift feels enormous. They find themselves wondering why their usual moves are not generating the same results anymore. When they send a message and nothing comes back, when they try to provoke a reaction and get nothing, they lose an important source of reassurance about their own power. That is exactly why some of these individuals start cycling through wildly different behaviors after silence begins. One day they might suddenly turn on the charm. They might sound warm, reflective, almost apologetic. They might bring up old memories, things you did together, things that used to make you smile. The very next day, they might become cold, critical, even hostile. They might try to twist the knife in subtle ways. They might try to make you jealous. They might reach out to mutual friends fishing for information. Or they might act as though they have completely moved on, like nothing ever mattered. And if you are watching this right now and feeling a little sick to your stomach because you have lived through exactly this kind of whiplash, stay with me. There is a reason behind all of it. And once you see it, it cannot unsee you. These shifting responses look emotionally inconsistent on the surface, but underneath, they almost always share one common goal. They are testing whether they still have access to your attention. They are testing whether they can still shape how you feel from a distance. The specific strategy changes, but the underlying objective stays the same. They are trying to restore a sense of influence that has suddenly been interrupted. And once you understand that, you also understand why endless conversations rarely create lasting change. If the deeper concern is maintaining influence instead of building mutual understanding, every emotional discussion you agree to can actually reinforce the very pattern you are trying to escape. Choosing not to step back into that loop changes the entire balance. It removes the opportunity for them to keep directing your emotional responses. It leaves them without the certainty they used to take for granted. And for the first time, they have to sit with the discomfort of not knowing what you are doing, what you are feeling, or whether they still matter to you at all. One of the most misunderstood pieces of this entire dynamic is the idea of emotional supply. Most people hear that phrase and immediately think of compliments, praise, admiration, public flattery. But the reality is much bigger than that. Emotional supply includes any form of attention that reinforces the other person's sense of importance or influence. Praise plays a role, yes. But so do arguments, emotional scenes, repeated forgiveness, constant reassurance, and even obvious heartbreak. If your thoughts, emotions, and daily energy consistently revolve around the other person, they remain right at the center of your psychological world. That position becomes deeply reinforcing for them because it constantly confirms that they still matter, that they still hold weight, that the dynamic they built is still functioning. During the relationship, you may have believed that all your efforts to explain yourself, resolve misunderstandings, or save the connection were acts of love. You might have spent hours analyzing their messages, drafting thoughtful responses, and trying to convince them to see things from your perspective. From your side, those actions felt like commitment. From their side, those actions were proof that they still had full access to your attention. Whether you were expressing affection, frustration, disappointment, or quiet desperation, your attention stayed glued to them, and that constant engagement quietly became a reliable source of validation for them. Not because every interaction felt pleasant, but because every single interaction confirmed that they still occupied a central place in your emotional life. This is also why conflicts in these dynamics can drag on for far longer than anyone expects. Most people assume arguments happen because two individuals genuinely want to resolve a real problem. In healthier relationships, that assumption usually holds. But in patterns like these, conflict itself becomes a disguised way of preserving connection. Every disagreement creates another opportunity for communication. Every disagreement creates another chance to defend themselves, shift blame, or pull you back into defending your feelings. As long as you remain emotionally engaged, the relationship continues to provide them with attention, even when that attention is soaked in pain and confusion. When you stop reaching out completely, that stream of emotional energy disappears. There are no more lengthy explanations to respond to. There are no more emotional reactions to bait. There are no more reassurance-seeking messages to expect. There are no more desperate repair attempts to reward. And for someone who has come to depend on that steady flow, the absence can feel surprisingly intense. Instead of receiving a reliable stream of attention, they are now face to face with silence, and silence offers almost nothing for them to work with. There is no argument to challenge. There is no apology to accept or reject. There is no visible sign that they still occupy your emotional world. Because of that, some of these individuals will attempt to re-establish contact in ways that look completely contradictory on the surface. They might suddenly become unusually kind. They might offer surprising apologies. They might reminisce about happier days. They might reach out with casual questions that seem unimportant. On the other hand, they might also criticize you, spread rumors, express anger, or act as if you never mattered at all. These two approaches look like polar opposites, but at the core, they are doing the same thing. They are probing to see whether the emotional supply can be reactivated. If you respond with strong emotion, whether that emotion is positive or negative, the familiar rhythm begins to return. When there is no response, the supply they once took for granted is no longer available in the way they expected, and that alone disrupts everything they are used to. One of the most uncomfortable experiences for anyone with strong narcissistic patterns is sustained uncertainty. Everyone on Earth deals with uncertainty from time to time. Most people learn to handle it by trusting close relationships, communicating honestly, and accepting that they cannot control every outcome. But individuals with strong narcissistic patterns experience uncertainty very differently. A huge portion of their confidence depends on feeling like they can predict how people will respond to them. They get used to anticipating reactions. They get used to forecasting behaviors. They get used to believing they can steer the emotional direction of any relationship they enter. When someone consistently responds in familiar ways, that predictability builds a kind of psychological stability inside them. They know which words are likely to trigger guilt. They know which gestures tend to invite forgiveness. They know which behaviors keep things moving in the direction that benefits them most. Over time, those patterns become deeply ingrained. If every disagreement ends with you reaching out first, they expect exactly that. If every stretch of silence ends with you sending a message, they see that as the natural rhythm. Even your emotional reactions, the tears, the frustration, the repetitive explanations, become predictable responses that reassure them they still understand how to influence the situation. That predictability gives them confidence because they rarely have to question whether their actions will produce the outcome they want. The relationship starts to feel less like a partnership between two equal people and more like a system whose responses they believe they can fully anticipate. Everything shifts the moment you stop reaching out completely. Your silence introduces a variable they cannot easily interpret. They no longer know what you are feeling. They no longer know what decisions you have made. They no longer know whether you have emotionally detached from the relationship altogether. They cannot tell if you are still thinking about them. They cannot tell if you have found peace. They cannot tell if someone else has quietly become important in your life. Unlike arguments or emotional conversations, silence provides almost no information. It offers no clues about your state of mind. It gives them no opportunity to measure whether their influence still exists. For someone who has built their confidence on emotional predictability, that lack of information becomes genuinely unsettling because they are no longer able to calculate their next move with any certainty. That uncertainty often pushes them to seek information in indirect ways. They might quietly check your social media. They might ask mutual friends subtle questions about you. They might revisit old conversations they had with you. They might even manufacture reasons to make contact. Sometimes all of that is less about genuine curiosity and more about reducing the internal discomfort that uncertainty creates. Knowing where you stand emotionally helps them restore a sense of control. Not knowing leaves them facing a situation they cannot easily manage, even if they would never admit out loud that it bothers them. The inability to predict your behavior challenges the confidence they once carried so easily. It undermines their belief that they can always shape the direction of the dynamic, and that alone is enough to throw them off balance. What makes silence so psychologically powerful is that it removes the script they had come to rely on completely. There is no argument to win. There is no explanation to dismiss. There is no apology to twist. There is no emotional reaction to measure. Instead, they are left sitting with unanswered questions that cannot be resolved through the strategies they have used for years. The certainty they depended on begins to dissolve because the person they thought they understood is no longer playing their role in the predictable pattern that gave them confidence in the first place. If this is starting to hit close to home, take a breath, stay with me, because the next part is where everything really shifts. When someone stops reaching out to a person with strong narcissistic patterns, it is not unusual for reconnecting attempts to follow. Many people are caught off guard by this because they expected silence to mean the end of the dynamic for both sides. But when the usual flow of attention and emotional engagement suddenly disappears, some individuals will try to restore what they lost. These attempts can look very different on the outside, and understanding the psychology behind them is usually far more useful than focusing only on the specific behavior. The goal is rarely to rebuild a healthy connection. In most cases, the goal is to figure out whether access, influence, or emotional responsiveness is still available in any form. One of the most common approaches is charm. Someone who was cold, dismissive, or critical for months or years can suddenly become warm, affectionate, and unusually attentive. They might send thoughtful messages out of nowhere. They might reminisce about old memories. They might offer compliments or speak as if they have suddenly understood your perspective perfectly. To someone who spent a long time hoping for even the smallest sign of acknowledgement, these shifts can feel incredibly convincing. It is perfectly natural to wonder whether they have genuinely changed this time. While real personal growth is always possible for anyone willing to do honest inner work over a long stretch of time, meaningful change is usually demonstrated through consistent actions over months and years, not through a sudden shift that only appears when access to the relationship has been lost. If the charm offensive does not get the reaction they want, guilt often becomes the next strategy. They might remind you of everything they supposedly did for you. They might suggest that you are abandoning them during a difficult time. They might imply that your decision to stay silent is somehow cruel, cold, or unfair. These messages are engineered to wake up your sense of responsibility and compassion. If you spent much of the relationship putting their emotional needs above your own, guilt can become an unusually powerful force because it pushes you to question whether protecting yourself is somehow selfish. When guilt fails to produce results, anger or criticism often shows up in its place. They might accuse you of being immature, unforgiving, or emotionally unstable. They might try to provoke a reaction through sharp insults, blame, or exaggerated accusations. Although these behaviors look completely different from charm, they often serve a similar psychological purpose. Any emotional response, whether that response is defensive, apologetic, or furious, confirms that they still have the ability to affect how you feel. The specific emotion does not really matter. What matters is that you are still emotionally engaged. Some individuals go even more indirect. They might reach out to mutual friends. They might interact with your social media in subtle ways. They might manufacture situations where a chance encounter feels likely. Others might present an entire image of having moved on, hoping that visible happiness or success will pull your attention and tempt you back into contact. These behaviors can feel deeply confusing because they swing so quickly between affection and hostility, closeness and distance. But when you look beneath the surface, a common thread usually shows up. They are searching for evidence that the emotional connection is still active. Your continued silence removes the reassurance they are looking for and leaves them without the predictable responses they once counted on to maintain their sense of influence. One of the most profound shifts that takes place when you stop reaching out is not what happens inside their mind, it is what happens inside yours. For a long stretch of the relationship, you may have been conditioned to believe that your emotional well-being depended entirely on their responses. One kind message could make your entire day feel hopeful. One cold remark could leave you questioning your own worth for days. Without even realizing it, you gradually handed over the power to determine how you felt about yourself. That is one of the most damaging effects of an unhealthy dynamic, because your sense of stability becomes tied to someone else's unpredictable behavior instead of your own values, your own judgment, and your own emotional resilience. When you decide not to reach out anymore, you start breaking that pattern piece by piece.